Hi, YouTube family. Get ready to hear one of the most astonishing survival stories ever told. This is the survival story of Beck Weathers. Over a harrowing period of 18 hours, Everest would do its best to devour Beck Weathers and his fellow climbers. In 1996, Beck Weathers faced certain death on the frozen slopes of Mount Everest, enduring brutal conditions that would claim the lives of many around him. But against all odds, he defied nature, overcame his limits, and lived to tell the tale. This is his incredible journey of survival, resilience, and redemption. Weathers, a pathologist from Dallas, Texas, was born on December 16, 1946, in a military family. He attended college in Wichita Falls, Texas, married and had 2 children. Weathers had long been driven by his obsession with high-altitude climbing. In 1986, he enrolled in a mountaineering course, and at 49 years of age, he had already scaled some of the world's tallest mountains. In the spring of 1996, he joined a guided expedition to climb Mount Everest, the world's highest peak. He considered Richard Bass, the first man to climb the 7 summits, an inspiration who made summiting Everest seem possible for regular guys. Weathers had trained for years, seeing this climb as a personal challenge, a way to break free from the depression that had haunted him for most of his life. As he ascended Everest, he carried not just the weight of his ambition, but also the hope that this climb would bring him clarity and purpose. Weathers said in an interview that he had spent most of my adult life in profound depression and turned to mountaineering and physical activity to reduce its effects. I never let anybody know about it, he said of his depression, and I discovered that if you drove your body hard, when you did that, you couldn't think. And that lack of thinking, as you punished your body and drove yourself, was amazingly pleasant. He was prepared to devote all of his energy to this climb and push himself as far as he needed to. After all, he had nothing to lose. His marriage had deteriorated because Weathers spent more time with mountains than his family. On May 10, 1996, Beck Weathers was part of a commercial expedition led by famed New Zealand mountaineer Rob Hall. Hall was an experienced climber who had formed an adventure climbing company after scaling each of the 7 summits. He had already summited Everest 5 times, and if he wasn't worried about the trek, no one should be. On May 10, 1996, 8 climbers in all set out on that May morning. The weather was clear and the team was upbeat. It was cold, but at the beginning, the 12 to 14-hour climb to the summit seemed like a breeze. Before long, however, Beck Weathers and his crew would realize just how brutal the mountain could be. Just before his trip to Nepal, Beck Weathers had a routine surgery to fix his nearsightedness. He underwent radial keratotomy, an early form of LASIK, which involved making small cuts in his corneas to improve his vision. When Hall discovered that Weathers could no longer see, he forbade him from continuing up the mountain, ordering him to remain on the side of the trail while he took the others to the top. When they circled back down, they would pick him up on their way. Weathers made the heartbreaking decision to stop just short of the summit, despite being just hours away from achieving his lifelong dream. Hall, his guide, told him to wait at a spot called the balcony while the others continued to the summit. Beck sat down to wait, unaware that a massive storm was about to hit the mountain, and that this storm would change the course of his life forever. As his 7 teammates trekked up to the summit, he remained in place. Several other groups passed him on the way down, offering him a spot in their caravans, but he refused, waiting for Hall like he'd promised. As night fell, a brutal snowstorm descended on Everest, bringing howling winds and freezing temperatures that plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm was so intense that climbers could barely see a few feet in front of them. After reaching the summit, one of the team members became too weak to go any further. Rather than leave him behind, Rob Hall decided to stay with him. Tragically, Hall eventually succumbed to the freezing temperatures and died on the mountain. His body still lies frozen just below the south summit today. Weathers remained on the mountain, blind and exposed to the elements, slowly freezing to death. Nearly 10 hours passed before Beck Weathers realized something was wrong, but stranded alone beside the trail, he had no choice but to wait for someone to pass by. Around 5 p.m., a climber came down and informed Weathers that Rob Hall was trapped higher up. Although Weathers knew he should descend with the climber, he chose to wait for another teammate who had been reported to be not far behind. Mike Groom, an experienced guide who had previously summited Everest, was Hall's co-leader. When Groom arrived, he helped Weathers and the exhausted group of climbers begin their trek back to camp, where they braced themselves for a long, freezing night. As a storm intensified on the mountain, it buried the area in snow and reduced visibility to nearly zero before the climbers could reach their camp. The group huddled together, nearly walked off the edge of the mountain while searching for their tents. During the chaos, Beck Weathers lost one of his gloves and started feeling the harsh effects of altitude and freezing temperatures. While his teammates huddled for warmth, Weathers, delirious from the cold, stood up in the wind, raising his arms with his right hand already frozen beyond recognition. He began shouting, claiming he'd figured everything out. But then, a powerful gust of wind knocked him backward into the snow. In the midst of the storm, several climbers, including some of the best and most experienced mountaineers, lost their lives. Beck Weathers was presumed to be among them. At one point, he collapsed into the snow, unconscious and frostbitten. He had no feeling in his limbs, and his body temperature was dangerously low. That night, a Russian guide rescued the rest of Beck Weathers' team, but after assessing his condition, decided Weathers was beyond saving. On Everest, it's customary to leave those who perish on the mountain, and it seemed Weathers was fated to become one of them. On May 11th, after spending nearly 15 hours in the freezing, stormy conditions, something stirred inside him. He regained consciousness and, incredibly, found the strength to get to his feet. Disoriented, half-blind, and suffering from severe frostbite, he staggered toward Camp 4. It was a superhuman effort. Many climbers far less injured had perished on Everest, but Beck's mind willed him to survive. He stumbled into the camp, where the shocked climbers couldn't believe their eyes. Weathers was barely alive, his face blackened with frostbite, and his hands so badly damaged that they were beyond saving. His body was battered, but his spirit remained indomitable. The next morning after the storm had passed, a Canadian doctor was sent up to retrieve Weathers and a Japanese woman from his team named Yasuko Namba, who had also been left behind. After peeling a sheet of ice from her body, the doctor decided that Namba was beyond saving. When he saw Weathers, he was inclined to say the same. His face was encrusted with ice, his jacket was open to the waist, and several of his limbs were stiff with cold. Frostbite was not far off. The doctor would later describe him as being as close to death and still breathing as any patient he had ever seen. Weathers was left for dead a second time. However, Beck Weathers wasn't dead, and though he was close, his body was inching further from death by the minute. By some miracle, Weathers awoke from his hypothermic coma around 4 p.m. Incredibly, Beck Weathers managed to pull himself together and descend the mountain, stumbling on feet that felt like porcelain and were nearly numb. When he reached a lower camp, the climbers there were astonished. Despite his blackened, frost-bitten face and the likelihood that his limbs would never fully recover, Weathers was still walking and talking. As word of his miraculous survival spread back to base camp, even more shock followed. It wasn't just that Beck Weathers was alive. He had seemingly come back from the dead. Within hours, the base camp technicians had alerted Kathmandu, but the next challenge was getting Beck off the mountain. Given the severity of his injuries, his situation was critical. Fortunately, the storm had cleared enough for a daring helicopter rescue attempt, something almost unheard of at such altitudes. A skilled Nepalese pilot risked his life, navigating the thin air and perilous winds to land the helicopter just below the camp, where Beck was loaded on board and flown to a hospital in Kathmandu. His survival was nothing short of a miracle, but the cost was severe. Beck Weathers' frostbite was so extreme that he lost his right arm below the elbow, most of his left hand, and the fingers on both hands. He also endured extensive reconstructive surgeries on his face, which had been ravaged by frostbite. Despite the physical toll, Beck returned home with a renewed perspective on life. His close brush with death on Everest led him to reevaluate his priorities. Before Everest, his obsession with climbing had strained his relationship with his family. But after his miraculous survival, he began to focus on rebuilding those bonds. Today, Beck Weathers has left mountain climbing behind. Although he didn't complete his goal of scaling all 7 summits, he believes he ultimately emerged victorious. His wife, furious that he had been left for dead, chose not to divorce him and instead stayed by his side to help him recover. In the end, his brush with death saved his marriage, and he later shared his story in his book, Left for Dead: My Journey Home from Everest. While he returned physically diminished, Weathers says that spiritually he's more whole than ever before. Beck Weathers' survival on Mount Everest is not just a story of physical endurance, but also one of emotional and spiritual rebirth. He emerged from the mountain a changed man, with a deeper appreciation for life and the people around him. His survival, documented in Jan Krakauer's best-selling book Into Thin Air, and later portrayed in the 2015 movie Everest, has since inspired millions of people. Beck's story reminds us that, even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can find the strength to endure and rise above unimaginable odds. Thank you so much for watching this video and exploring Beck Weathers' incredible survival story with us. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing stories of resilience and adventure. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.